Hello and welcome to DocFest. I'm sure this can't be your first event, but I'm going to welcome you anyway. My name is Danny Leigh. Welcome to today's event, Breaking the Class Ceiling 2019. It's kind of the second part of an event which started rolling yesterday afternoon when we had Paul Greengrass come here and talk a little bit about his career and his life as a filmmaker, but also specifically about his take on class. And what we might think of, I think, as a sort of crisis of opportunity. It's a long crisis of opportunity. Britain is a country with a class system, so there's always been problems and issues around people breaking through. I think what we need to sort of crack open is the question of whether we are moving forwards or going backwards with that. We can discuss this today, I think. I'm here because I did a project last year with the BFI called Working Class Heroes, which was something which started out being around actors and a conversation about whether working class actors were getting the opportunities that they used to. And it then kind of broadened out because as soon as you start talking about that, you think, well, actually, once you start asking the question about actors, don't you then start asking the question about working class scriptwriters, about working class directors? Don't you then start talking about working class documentarians as well as people working in fiction? So that's why I'm here. I'm going to introduce each of our panel in turn. I apologise, I'm going to go to my piece of paper at this stage because everyone here has had a checkered career and a wonderful career, so I want to make sure everyone is done justice to. We're joined by Fiona Campbell. Fiona became in January the head of BBC Three. She was previously the digital director of BBC News. She's been heavily involved in the BBC Women in Leadership schemes, mentoring members of new staff on their career progression. We're also joined by Billie J.D. Porter. Billie J.D. Porter is a journalist and documentary filmmaker who has worked both in front of and behind the camera for the likes of BBC Three, Channel 4 and Vice. She's currently developing her first feature documentary in Los Angeles. Paul Sng is a director whose films focus on people who challenge the status quo through working in a collaborative way to capture extraordinary aspects of ordinary life. His films include Sleaford Mods, Invisible Britain, Dispossession, The Great Social Housing Swindle, and Polystyrene, I Am a Cliché, which is currently in production. Kieren Yates is a journalist, broadcaster and filmmaker. Her documentaries tell stories of everything from Muslim drag queens in the UK to First Nation communities in Montana, tampon tax protests in Mumbai and beyond. Her first radio doc, Estate Music, is on Radio 4 now. It's also excellent. Victoria Musguin-Rowe is a freelance series producer and development exec with a track record for legally and ethically complex documentary and factual drama. Her recent credits include the double Grierson-winning Stephen, The Murder That Changed the Nation for BBC One, and the returning BBC Two series Conviction, Murder at the Station. If you're here because Carol Morley was going to be with us, Carol Morley has had an emergency and has been detained in London. I hope you're going to stick with us anyway, because I think this is going to be fun. Mia Bays, the great Mia Bays, is currently down with food poisoning in Plymouth. She would have been, if anyone on earth would have been here if they could, it was Mia. She has sent a statement that she would like me to read out, and so she is contributing to the conversation. Zamir says, I'm really sorry that illness has taken me away from this opportunity to join in a conversation that I feel passionately about. I know that I'm a pretty rare bird, a poor kid from a single-parent family raised on income support who has been in film for nearly 30 years, produced an Oscar winner, and who has reinvented myself several times. Film has taught me everything I know, but it's not reflected me back at myself, and it's often excluded me and made people like me feel not welcomed. The main barriers for people like me entering the business today are financial or lack of support networks, encouragement, possibilities, accessibility, scant opportunities. Careers aren't ladders, they're more like climbing frames. You sometimes have to go across before you can go to the next level. I hope we will see more gatekeepers from diverse and disadvantaged backgrounds, more mindful approaches to hiring, to nurturing, to career development, to opportunities, to financial support, more opportunities, more openness to difference, less reliance on the obvious signs and signifiers. It's essential to have these conversations and to really hear and see each other and to grow this brilliant medium together. So that's Mia Bays, a taste of Mia Bays, who would have been here today were she not stuck in Plymouth. I'm going to ask, it feels like to talk about class, you talk about a lot of elephants in the room, and it feels like the first elephant in the room is actually, the name working class is something, as I say, I was involved in a project last year with working class there, in the title Working Class Heroes. Is this a name that actually still has relevance? Is the baggage around the term working class, is it helpful, is it unhelpful? I want to ask each of our panellists that in turn and also find out a little bit about your background, whether you feel working class. Fiona, I'm going to start with you.
I think the thing to say for me is I'm from Belfast. I only ever set foot in England for the first time when I was 18. I didn't know anybody from journalism. I certainly didn't know anybody in telly or in movies or anything like that. and I was the first person in my family to go to university. I did go to Cambridge, which I don't shy away from. That was the first push in the late 80s to get state school people into that place. So I benefited from that. I don't think in class terms, weirdly. I sort of see myself as coming from a certain place, a very specific place, geographically, and from a certain time in that place, because obviously there's a lot of the troubles were going on then, and that was very old defining in my life. So I don't, use that term working class because I just don't think of myself like that, but I think of myself as other, and I feel quite separate as a result of that, yeah. Okay.
Billie, how about you?
Yeah, I don't know that the term, I've always kind of found it quite difficult to define myself because my immediate family situation was very different to my wider family situation. So on my father's side, I felt like he was quite privileged, but I grew up just with my parents in a housing association flat. My parents struggled with substance abuse, still do, and so kind of my reality was very, very separate to that of my family. And I think my kind of upbringing was very different to my cousins who went to grammar or private schools, and I went to a local, very shitty comprehensive. And so it was like, I always felt like a bit of a kind of divide with my identity. And also just my parents as well. Like my mother's from Hull, and when she moved to London to go to drama school, she was told immediately, like, you're not going to get any jobs if you keep your accent. And so she kind of essentially went to elocution lessons and changed her dialect. And so I kind of felt like I grew up with this like idea of performing in a way, or like kind of trying to hide my background. So I kind of adopted this idea that I was less working class than I am. Like even today when we were talking about the panel, I was like, I don't really identify as working class. I'm like, my parents are part-time cleaners and live in a housing association flat, so I guess I am, but the term still feels a bit outdated and confusing to me, I guess.
Yeah, it does feel like we need to tweak it, to fine-tune it, maybe.
Yeah.
Paul? Or maybe we don't.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that the term is, it's not a universal term, is it? And I think if you look at the Great British Class Survey that was done, and they came up with 7 new distinctions of class that range from elites down to precariat, and I think there is a traditional sense of what working class identity is. For me, I identify first of all as someone that's biracial, and then probably working class after that. But growing up in London, where I grew up in a working class community, and being half Singaporean Chinese and half English, the racism that I experienced from a very young age was mainly from working class people, from not just white working class people, but also from black working class kids. And so the term to me, my family, although my mum and dad split up when I was very young, so I wasn't really in touch with being, other. I was kind of, in a way, ashamed of being Chinese because it was something that I was, bullied over. And so my understanding of class, from a very early age was tainted by that. And it was only through growing up and then beginning to sort of, come to terms with identity that I would say I then embraced the term. But certainly it's, something that there is no universal concept of. And it does need, but it's a question that is vital and does need discussions like this, definitely in this industry. I mean,
it feels like the opportunity, I guess, about talking about class is that it also gives us a chance to talk about class and race as well, where there's this huge, obvious intersection. Kieren, tell us about your relationship with class.
Yeah, so, I've always grown up in estates. I'm from London, and I'm the child of a single-parent family. But both my parents are from Punjab, India side. And so, yeah, I think that the intersection of race and class obviously has been crucial to the way that I see my own identity and the way that I see my wider community and my place in it. I think this is actually something that a lot of the peers that I grew up with have felt as well, which is that they hadn't really been asked to consider their class identity until they were moving in, what one might see as more middle class circles, because it is just par for the course. That is your day-to-day. And then what happens is that when there's conversations around social mobility, often what that really means is sort of transcending where you've come from. So moving out of the estate that you came from, moving out of maybe the sort of comprehensive school circles. And I think that that doesn't really happen when your family still live in the same place and within the same community. So what happens is that, you move and you might meet new people in university and, sort of in this industry, which you might feel othered by, and then you sort of go back to my mum's house, and I feel like nothing has really changed. But then you sort of, now I like the sort of M&S nice expensive orange juice, and so you know what I mean. And so those all of those preoccupations become part of your lifestyle. But then again, for me, I haven't had money for longer in my life than I have had money, and that's the way that you still see those things, and then the balance changes. But yeah, certainly those conversations are increasingly asked by people who are outside of that. And yeah, I think that we need to really challenge the way that we think about socially mobile identity, or that that you've gotten above that, and you're able to leave that behind and give yourself a better life, or something like that. I don't think that that's true at all.
It's weird, isn't it? Because class is always talked about when it is talked about in terms of social mobility, and the very name itself implies, as you say, you're leaving something behind, and it's not about necessarily leaving a lack of money behind. It's about leaving like an identity behind. It's almost like that's what you're encouraged to do.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of the council estates in the UK, for instance, sort of the post-war 50s and 60s builds. Lots of those estates, I'm from Southall and Hayes and sort of Zone 6 in West London, and lots of those estates at the time were sort of built with a life cycle in mind, that you might live in a smaller place, and then you would go to the local school, which was just adjacent to your estate, and then you would move into a bigger place, which was like a 4-bedroom place for your family, and everyone would stay in the same place, and the life cycle of the estate would kind of always help you. And then when you had your children, there was a little playground that you would go to. So, as a result, when you're reporting on those kinds of stories, whether it's kind of the Lancaster West estate and, the big Grenfell story that lots of journalists were going to, you understand the sort of the organisms and the organic nature of how those things work, because the life cycle for me has always been part of that, and it still feels like home. But I think maybe that's not the same for everyone.
Sure. Well, Victoria, let me bring you in at that point. What's your relationship with that name working class? And has that always been, if it is important to you, has it always been important to you?
So I grew up in East London. My dad's a lorry driver and my mum was a cashier in a bank. And I always felt that we were quite privileged growing up in comparison to a lot of the people that I went to school with. It was only when I got to university that I realised that wasn't really the case, and actually I was quite working class. And going into TV, I desperately wanted to work in current affairs because I thought that would let me tell the stories of the people that I grew up around, and found constant barriers that were connected to the way that I spoke and my sort of cultural touch points. I just had absolutely no idea with what a lot of the directors and executive producers were sort of talking about when I was in those meetings. And so there was a sort of period of time where I tried to become sort of a imposter middle-class person, which failed miserably. And it was only after sort of moving into documentaries and doing stuff around kind of working-class issues that I realised that was where my upbringing was my strength. I could talk to people in a relatable way because I'd grown up in the same environments. And so there was a moment for me as an AP where I realised that actually being working class was my USP, and I became really attached to that term. I think that it's quite a loaded label, but I actually think of working class as quite a nostalgic thing. I think of community and I think of close family bonds, and so I now actually label myself reluctant middle class because I actually strongly identify with all of the sort of ethics and morals of being working class and growing up in that environment, but my paycheck and my title don't necessarily reflect that anymore. So I think I actually see it in quite a positive way in comparison to how some of the other panellists think about it.
It feels weird. I mean, obviously, I'm of a certain age, and it's that sense of what class is has changed definitely over the course of my lifetime, because there were these definite landmarks about what class meant in the past, and it was about you were working class if you didn't go to university, and you were working class if you didn't own your own home. And now it feels like we're at a point socially where actually lots of people go to university. The question mark is what happens to them afterwards. And lots of people generationally of traditionally all classes are being shut out of the housing market, so they're never going to own their own home. So that as a kind of class signifier doesn't really seem like it has any currency anymore. I mean, I wonder if it's fascinating because everybody has quite different ideas about their own relationship with the name working class, about their own experience of it. I wonder if there are overlaps, though, and intersections. I mean, what would be the common threads here? Lack of money is one. So it's certainly not necessarily living in poverty, but not at the same time living with a kind of plump mattress of cash. Private education, I guess, would be the other thing. I mean, are those kind of ideas useful ideas? Again, thinking about, because we're going to frame the conversation in terms of the film and TV industry, ways in, how you stay in. Are those issues around not coming from money and coming from state school, I suppose for each of you actually, were they factors when you broke into the industry, and are they still factors now? I think I'm going to work around the other way this time. I'm going to go anti-clockwise. I'm going to start with you, Victoria.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I did a TV production degree at Bournemouth, and it was very apparent that most of the people on my course were related to someone who could help them get into the industry, and I just did not have that connection. I mean, for me, like, media didn't feel like an option growing up where I did. The only reason why I fell into TV was, this is so embarrassing, I should not admit this publicly. I was obsessed with the band Busted when I was about 13 years old. This is so embarrassing. And
we all were.
Really, really, and now it's on record publicly. I used to phone up at the end of SMTV Live. That shows my age as well. I used to phone up to try and get tickets, because tickets were free and I could take all my friends from school, which meant that their parents didn't have to pay for anything. And then I felt really cool, because we'd get to go and see these bands or like meet celebrities. And so I used to phone up all the time and go along sort of every Saturday that I could get tickets with friends. And one day that I was there, they left a load of cabling on a stage, and I tripped over it and landed on Brian Dowling and Patsy Palmer, which is really embarrassing. And they all shit themselves and thought that I was going to sue them. So they took me behind the scenes of the studio and introduced me to all the celebrities. And there was this moment of realization that actually there was this whole creative industry that I didn't know about. And that was the moment for me that I really decided that I wanted to go into TV. And even though I'd seen that world, I had no idea how to get into it. And so it was sort of my mum's perseverance of helping me research about, universities. No one in my family had gone to university, so this was a whole new experience for my parents. But it was having that sort of supportive family, even though they didn't have the connections to try and help me find a degree to go and do that. And so I got to Bournemouth, but then once you have this degree, there's nowhere to go with it, because I didn't have those connections, and I sent the 300 letters and no one was replying to me. And that was the moment I felt like, having seen everyone else in my course, that was what I was lacking. I was lacking connections, and I was lacking access. And I think that that's something that, for the next 10 years of my career, I definitely felt was a hindrance and a barrier.
Okay. Kieren, how does that tally with your experience of breaking into kind of journalism and broadcasting?
Yeah, I think it's funny because for me, there was a couple of things that I really noticed. One was that there is a different language. There's a different language that is spoken, and the way of communicating is totally different, because there's a lot of assumed knowledge. And the assumed knowledge isn't the knowledge that you think is going to be assumed, like, whether you've, read the literary canon. It's about other sort of, more sort of culturally specific things that are quite strange. And if you're not part of that world, there's a little bit of sort of like Wikipediaing, like what that might mean and like how that is used. And I thought that was quite strange. So it felt like there was a little bit of social safari. And so I was a little bit of like, oh, what are you talking about? So it wasn't only that there was, a lot more whiteness in the industry that I had not grown up with, and that I was not part of my local environment. It was also that there was this kind of assumed kind of upper middle class identity. And, sort of working in TV, certainly, I've come across subsequently lots of sort of, upper class sort of bohemian eccentrics which is so completely divorced from the world that I grew up in. But it's kind of been fascinating and thrilling for me to be like, oh, you own an estate? Oh, tell me about that. And so I think it's, it's about like, sometimes it works both ways, isn't it? It's like you're seeing the sort of like fascinating sort of external lens from those stories, and you're also seeing the internal lens from the communities that you've come from. But I think that's also the thing about representation, isn't it? It's like, when I think people sometimes, when they hear this idea of like, oh, we need to see ourselves on screen, they sort of wrongly assume that you're talking about your own individual life experience, and it's not that. What you're really talking about when you're talking about representation is the whole world that you've come from. So for me, I was like, wow, imagine that, like, lots of like the docs that I've seen not only don't represent my story, but don't even represent like the people that I went to school with, or like the people that like I grew up with, or the people that like work with my mum, or like work in the local area. So it's not that you don't represent me, it's like you don't represent this whole bit. And that's when I was like, oh yeah, okay, I get it.
Yeah, because it's weird. I think a lot of people's experience is that they encounter what is quite a homogenous world, and their own experience of life is put into a different perspective. So I've got a friend, the journalist Ellen Jones, who grew up in Hackney, and as far as she was concerned when she was a girl, she was the posh girl, because single-parent family, but her mum was a teacher. So where she was, that meant she was posh. And then she sort of moves through, goes to Cambridge, and literally her first day at Cambridge is, maybe I'm not so posh after all. So it's a very sort of jarring experience, I think.
Yeah, well, it's the intersection of both those things, isn't it? So it's like definitely when I was like going into sort of journalism and broadcast, it was like there was always that assumed thing, you know, like you have to know about Bob Dylan, but we don't have to know about like Dizzy Rascal or like Bhangra or those things. Sure. It's like, you know, so it becomes very clear like what you have to know, but that doesn't go both ways.
Paul, when you spoke earlier about being othered kind of earlier in your life, and when you became a filmmaker and started moving into documentary, was there an othering going on there as well?
I think so, yeah. I mean, the first time I came to this festival 3 years ago, so I've only been making films for 4 years, and I came here and I was at a drinks event, and this guy that I know, I'm not going to name him obviously because that's not fair, he's not here to defend himself, but he exclaimed in front of a group of people that I didn't know, "Imposter, imposter, what are you doing here, imposter?" And he was joking, but that's not nice. And he's middle class, and that comes from a position of privilege. And he apologised afterwards. I didn't accept his apology, by the way. Maybe I should. If I see him, I might talk to him. But it was incredibly othering, you know, new in filmmaking, and you know, in a room full of people, amongst people that would hopefully are my peers, to be called an imposter. And I don't think he meant it in a nasty way. I think he meant it as a joke, but it just goes to show you that people's intentions can often, you know, expose, you know, certainly what was an unconscious bias probably in the room as well. And I do think that, you know, what we've all been talking about as well, one thing that we could touch on that a couple of you have mentioned already is, as well as it being financial and cultural, another thing that I think comes into class is food and diet. I mean, when I grew up, we always had white bread. I didn't have pasta until I was probably a teenager. I remember going to a girlfriend's house when I was 16, and she had all these jars of these, my mum had all these funny jars of weird things in. I was like, "What's that?" And the mum looked at me, she was middle class, and she went, "It's pasta." And I'd never seen it. I'd seen spaghetti and spaghetti hoops and things like that, but I didn't know what this stuff was. And I became very aware of, you know, when going out, you know, and eating and going to people's houses, that if you're middle class, you often have a very different diet. And sometimes you can feel a bit, I suppose, intimidated by food, and you can feel a bit, you know, like, I don't know what they're talking about. And it carries on in the industry when you go into an event, that there is almost a code of maybe behaviour, and you know, as we've been saying, certain things that people touch on that you are expected to know, and as you were just saying, it's not reciprocal.
I had the exact same conversation with someone recently about the diet thing. Right. It's interesting, because I remember like the first time I tried sushi and stuff, and it was such a sort of like novel thing for me. And even recently I was at this screening in LA, and I remember pointing at something and being like, "What the fuck is that?" And everyone was like, "It's olive tapenade." Like, what are you talking about? But yeah, I had the same thing, and I remember being so embarrassed for some reason that I was on the free school meals program at school. I remember trying to hide it. Like, I would ask my parents for like change, and I would rather like get a bag of crisps and go hungry than go and be part of the free school meals program, because I wanted to hang out with the people who weren't on it. It just felt like such a kind of label in a way. And it feels kind of ashamed to admit that I was ashamed, because it's ridiculous. But it's obviously so stigmatized to be poor in a way that we don't really speak about, especially for young people, that I felt that, you know, harbored that.
And I think that the heartbreaking thing is I think that still happens today as well. I was telling Victoria actually just earlier. So obviously I'm from the BFI, and the BFI have a range of kind of, you know, activities going on, and they do very much try to be inclusive. They have something called the Film Academy, which is supposed to be their sort of 16 to 19-year-old, you know, it's like pre-film school training, essentially, like a 2-week residential thing. And they've made a lot of effort to try and make that inclusive. And what they did specifically was set aside 30% of places for people for kids on free school meals. And I was speaking to the organizer, who was saying, she came from Canada originally, so you don't necessarily understand understand the nuance of the class system, I think, if you come from elsewhere. And she said it took her a while to get her head around why, when she was looking at the forms, people either said, no, I am not eligible for free school meals, or they seemed to leave the question blank and move on. And she said literally form after form after form. And then it took her after about a year, she thought, oh, maybe people don't want to actually say even on a form.
And there were things that you were kind of entitled to. I remember at school, like whether or not you'd have assistance for a school trip, and they would be very public about, announcing which kids would qualify for that assistance. And it's awkward because you don't understand your parents' situation. I think, I found that, when I started working as well and moving in media circles, I started in the industry so young. I left home really young. I've got no higher education whatsoever. So that was something that always felt a bit like even yesterday, someone made a joke about Freshers Week at a party, and I was like, well, I don't have any higher education. I don't really know what you're talking about. I can't relate. But as well as that, I remember being with journalists who I thought were really kind of liberal, understanding, intelligent people making sort of comments or jokes about people on the dole or signing on, or if someone had lost their job. And I was like, well, that's my reality. I remember going to the job center every week with my dad. So, am I not supposed to vocalize that in this situation? And I was 16 when I was moving in these circles, so I kind of didn't really know how to broach that or understand why it made me feel so weird and ashamed. And I think another thing that is so kind of part of class, and you and I were talking about it the other day, Victoria, is all of the other aspects of it to do with your background in terms of your parents' mental health. That has a huge impact on your quality of life growing up, and how much access you have to things that middle-class families might have as well. And so, I found it really difficult to kind of be open with my peers in media circles about my parents' substance abuse issues, which is kind of ironic, seeing as everyone who works in the media is like a cokehead. But I, was so kind of ashamed. And I remember kind of telling an editor that I was working for about this incident that had happened with my father after he'd, had relapsed or something. And he was like, God, your dad sounds like a dick. And I remember being like, well, no, he's one of the best people I've ever met, but you obviously have such a small and limited understanding of the disease of addiction. And, oh, wait, okay, now I know that I can't be open in these circles, and they can't know about my background just because they won't understand, and it'll be upsetting.
And in class terms, it's interesting how terms of abuse have remained constant in ways that would just be unthinkable in lots of other contexts. So when we did the BFI event last year, again, a lot of that was weighted towards actors, and one of the young actors in the audience said that she had been encouraged by quite a middle-class casting director, the week before, to really chav it up when she went for the audition. And she said it's not the first time you hear that, Fiona, let me bring you in. I mean, how much of this is chiming with your experience kind of breaking into the media? And do you think things are changing, have changed?
I think talking about access, leadership, and sort of wages is interesting, because I'll just make as an interesting note, when I got my first 6-month contract, which I got through applying for a job in the Media Guardian, my starting salary as a junior researcher was £18,000 24 years ago. Right. Now, there was something in the news this week about how there's been a 6% real fall in wages since 2018. Do you know what I mean? I think the industry overall, real wages are falling. They are falling across the board, but it definitely affects this industry, and that's a real barrier to entry because costs are going up, housing is going up. I came to London, I said I didn't know anybody, but I was able to sort of get into a really overcrowded house full of young Irish people, and I paid 50 quid a week in rent. That doesn't exist anymore. I think access is a key point, because, as I said, I didn't know anybody. I got my job through the newspaper, a 6-month contract, and then off I went. And I had to learn how to create my own access, and people still have to do that. There's many more schemes now than there were, and that means at least people get more touch points for entry, and then they become the person who benefits from that scheme. So I think that's a good thing. But I just think there could be a lot of more industry discussion about how we manage people's employment conditions, so length of service, contract renewal, wage progression. At the end of the day, there's a lot of money now in this industry, and there's a certain duty on everyone to be transparent. I think it's interesting, when I applied to be controller, I had to fill in an application form. And for the first time, at the back of the application form, there was a whole set of questions about what did your parents do when you were 14, what education, no background did your parents have, and, you know, the BBC at least is asking those questions of somebody like me who's like, you know, running a digital outfit, so that they can track who their people are at the top. And I think there needs to be more of that, because until there's transparency around, well, just who are the people we've got around us making the decisions, hiring other people, then you can't nail the conversation. You know, you've got to be able to nail a conversation on a wider level, and I think that's quite important. Not easy, but important. So at least those questions were there, because they really made me stop and think. I was like, wow, there's a whole other section to this thing. And it was good that it shocked me, but it was good that they were there. You know, I was really pleased to see that.
I wanted to ask you in some detail actually about how you felt we should best approach kind of cracking the nut and solving this, because there are different schools of thought about this. Paul Greengrass, when he was here yesterday, was saying it really does fall to the top of the industry to actually really tackle this head on, to start putting things in place, and to actually start bringing people in, and that's where the energy is going to come from, top down. But I wonder do you feel that is the best approach? There was another voice, somebody spoke up at the end, and again, it wasn't a hostile exchange, but it was a different slant on things. Someone stood up and said, well, no, it's actually more about like-minded people finding each other, and the industry should really just make space for them. So what does it need to be here? Does it need to be a top-down, kind of taking a measurement, asking questions, keeping things statistical? Or is it a little bit looser? Is it just a question of freeing up space for people to come through? It needs
to be a bit of everything. I think the transparency of information is good, because then people can be challenged in a factual way, in a more, you know, top-level way. I think that's good. And, you know, I went and spoke at a school. They have the Speakers for Schools program, which I really encourage everybody to sign up to. Where they assign you to go to a school and talk to the kids about what you do for a living. And I spoke to a bunch of 15-year-olds in Belfast, and it was really interesting, because Belfast isn't even properly on the Speakers for School programme, because of course it's across an ocean sort of thing. So that in itself says it all. So I really encourage people to do that, because again, chiming with what Paul Greengrass said, unless kids hear, oh, there is a job called this. So I didn't even know there was a thing called TV producer at all when I was at school, because nobody talked to me about that. It was only randomly once that Kenneth Branagh pitched up in Belfast, and he wasn't that famous then, and did a Saturday talk at the Queen's Film Theatre that I went to, and I thought, God, this sounds really interesting, but this is the first time I've heard anybody talk about it. So, you know, anybody who has any, you know, experience should be volunteering in schools to give kids ideas that this is something that they could genuinely go for. So you need that as well. But on top of that, I think, you know, mentoring is really important, and that is something I've benefited from, something I try and do a lot of, because it gets, what I've noticed through doing a lot of it is that when people are having really shit times, it's the thing that really just gets them through the really shit moment.
So Fiona mentored me, and it's the only reason why I'm still in telly, because I was very prepared to leave at one point. So I totally agree that mentoring is so important.
And everybody can do that, lower down, it's free. Yeah.
And I guess you're doing two things though. I mean, it's the extension of the hand, you know, it's the actual practical support, and it's setting an example, it's a role model. Because I remember, and I think maybe that's something that happens, you do hear the story time and time again of people kind of going to Oxford or Cambridge and then kind of making it through. But maybe that's not so much like direct nepotism. Maybe it's just being around other people and suddenly becoming aware of all these. So my friend Ellen, I mentioned earlier, when she wasn't really aware of journalism as a potential business until she was around other people her own age who were thinking about going to journalism. And then at that stage, you start thinking, oh, maybe I can do it too. But these things aren't often discussed, certainly not in state schools. They weren't in my day. I mean, when I was a kid, you went and worked in a bank.
And the other thing I would just I'd say is, you know, two people who really helped me stick in there when I was junior in my career was Steve Anderson, who ran Watchdog. He was from Liverpool, working class kind of guy, somebody I could really identify with and work under and thrive under. And then he was my editor, and Annie Robinson was there, and she was from Liverpool. So they were really inspirational people to work for when I was young. And then Steve Hewlett, who sadly is no longer with us, who was from Manchester, again, working class guy, member of the Communist Party, bloody brilliant, editor of Panorama. And those are the people that if you kind of need to seek out those people who have different voices, and talk in a more normal way, and who you can say anything in front of. Those are the really important people to have more of in the industry, so there's less common voices.
Sure. I mean, it feels like a conversation has definitely started and organisations are taking notice of that. And so the BBC, and the BBC have actually been in the vanguard of this, and then the BFI have started measuring socio-economic status as well, kind of using the BBC approach. Billie, I mean, is that kind of organisational approach, is that going to be useful to you, the fact that people are, at that level are talking about this? Is that on the ground, is that a help?
That stuff I haven't been privy to that or experienced that. I worry that it would have a similar thing to what I was talking about before about the whole free school meals thing. If you feel like you're there as a result of positive discrimination, then you might do you know what I mean? I unfortunately think that I've worked in circles with such kind of snobby people that it would actually probably create a divide that was quite negative. But I guess it's the start of a positive change, I think that there just needs to be more of an awareness about the way that we speak about issues that impact people from different backgrounds. I think that obviously we've now had this over the past 2 years, I guess, realization about harassment, and I hope that that's having an impact on what people talk about in the office and the way that they kind of address each other and the way that you would speak to your female co-workers as a man in an office. I think that there needs to be a kind of similar, revolution or some sort of conversation that's happening about the way that we speak to one another and about the way that we accept people from different backgrounds. You can't make fun of people being unemployed. You can't make fun of people for being depressed or being unable to work,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, Paul, I was wondering, because you told us that story earlier, which is kind of shocking, actually, when you think about it, about your friend.
Ex-friend.
Does it feel, since then, that was, 3 years ago, 4 years ago?
Yeah, 2017, yeah.
So there's been a certain amount of conversation, and again, organisations have started weighing in. It feels like something is happening. But, does it feel like that joke wouldn't be made anymore? Does it feel like your ex-friend would know better now, at least?
Perhaps, but I think, the problem is in society. And it's structural, isn't it? Because that's what inequality is. And, we've seen recently with the Jeremy Kyle scandal, a lot of people knew that was going on. And that kind of programming gets made because it's cheap and because people watch it. So there needs to be, I think, from, the very top up decisions made to not commission, that's beyond poverty porn, that show. The poverty porn, not all of it is, made with the intention of denigrating people. Most of it is, but I think in sometimes they kind of, they make something and they think that they're giving a voice. And of course they're not. They're actually, making things that really do discriminate against people and do encourage stigma, because a lot of people that watch poverty porn are working class. And, they watch things like, Benefit Street, Skins and all those programs. And a lot of people probably watch it and think, oh, I'm glad I'm not like that. But that isn't working class identity, what we're watching. What we're watching are people that are, often on very low incomes, often on benefits. And, it would be like taking, you don't see programs about upper class people that kind of lampoon them in the same way unless they're comedy shows. So I think we need to fundamentally to address the kind of programs that get made where people are very vulnerable and, there's terms like chav and terms, that exist like that come from that, and that's how they spread out in the media. We're responsible for that, whether we're filmmakers, whether we're commissioners, whether we're viewers. There needs to be a decision collectively to say no.
It's a real double-edged sword, though, isn't it? Vicky McClure from Line of Duty, again, when we were putting stuff together last year, she said, everybody takes the piss out of me for watching reality TV, but actually, she's just, by her own description, a Nottingham young working class woman. She says, this is where I see people like me on reality TV. I don't see them anywhere else. And then people laugh at me for it. Kieren, our backgrounds are similar in as much as, we came through The Guardian and the BBC, which are these, they would like to think of themselves as bastions of equal opportunity and making sure that people are given a fair shake of the stick professionally. What's been your experience?
Well, it's kind of similar. I think it's kind of interesting, that internal debate, I think, that lots of people in the industry are having about whether you can use existing institutions to get your ideas heard or whether you need to destroy and rebuild. And I think that actually there is, I understand how that is coming from either side. I personally think that we we do need to just create our own communities and create our own networks and kind of make sure we're making the right work from there and then try and get that commissioned. And also, I think that is the best way to try and kind of dismantle this idea of a safe pair of hands, because I think that what that really means is, using the same hands that have been, making programs for, the past 20 years by the same kinds of people, and, stop making programs for commissioners. And I think that you can always tell when that's the case, when you're talking about those examples of maybe Benefit Street and some other terrible things that I've seen before. I know that that's not with the community in mind. It's clearly for the commissioner. So you make your package and you move on. And so there's ethical questions about why you are drawn to a project. And I do think that when you are part of communities that are outside the status quo or outside of what you see or institutions that you've worked with, it gives you this really thrilling moment to be able to say, oh, that story is worth telling. And I think that goes back to your point about mentors. Mentorship sometimes is, the most impactful stuff is just someone saying, that's really interesting. Oh, something that is in your locality that you would never think of is really interesting to me because I don't know about that. And so positioning yourself as an expert on anything is really empowering. And that's totally the way that I made it through, because I knew that I was never going to be able to really do that, at institutions like, The Guardian, certainly. And so it was about, seeing what I did know and, seeing how I could use those stories and how I could use what I had. And, varying degrees of success. But that's kind of, I think that's the only way that you can begin to start challenging. And then the work speaks for itself, The work is just better when you come to it that way. And actually, even on the sort of diversity box ticking thing, I think it's actually fine. I think when I started out, I was much more no, I never want anyone to think that I got in just because of that. But now I just think it's dire visibility over everything,
Victoria, you've worked across the BBC and you've also worked across indies. And I wonder, from your experience in indies, are they listening to that conversation? Are they taking a cue from seeing people like the BBC, at least starting to take this issue more seriously, at least starting to talk about it? Or, so are indies like a potential utopia, or are indies actually like a bit of a kind of lawless place where we haven't moved forward?
I'm going to get myself in trouble, aren't I? So I've worked in smaller indies. I think there's a willingness. I think people do want to do that. It's just that the reality of committing to what that means isn't really there. I think one of the biggest hurdles for freelancers, and I've had conversations with people like Billie about this, is the idea of having to live contract to contract. And if you don't come from a family where you have that trust fund, then that's quite a difficult way to live, constantly thinking, am I going to pay my rent or my mortgage when this contract finishes? And I've worked at indies that I've felt want me there because of the ideas that I find and the access that I get, because of my background, actually physically putting blockades into me staying there. So there's one indie that I worked with that my contract finished in December. I said, will you be extending me to January? And they said, well, we'll let you know in January. And I said, well, I need to know, because I need to know whether I'm paying my rent over Christmas. And they said, well, we can't tell you till January. And I said, okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take another contract then. And I got told that I was blackmailing them. And so the exec stormed out and came back in a massive huff and basically said, oh, well, we don't like the idea of the Musguins all sat around one turkey bone at Christmas, so we'll pay you until January. This is a project that I'd developed and I'd produced and done all the access on and was essential in, but there was just such a lack of willingness to pay me into January. And for me, that was the difference between keeping my flat and or not. And so it wasn't a creative decision for me. It was survival. It was about survival. And I think that's where indies don't quite get it. I think there was a lot of willingness for people to embrace class and socio-economics as part of diversity, but that the idea of actually putting the money where their mouth isn't really there.
I was going to say, because I wanted to kind of move the conversation on to sort of maintaining a career. After people break in, how do you maintain it? And I wonder, is there an issue there about, as you say, people who in their own minds have the best will in the world and would love to promote socio-economic diversity. But if you have people running the companies who actually don't know what it's like to not be able to pay the phone bill, they don't know what it's like to not be able to pay the phone bill.
Totally. I mean, I said to that exec, I was just so shocked that someone had spoken to me in that way after I'd been working so hard on a project for them, and that I was so integral in, that I said, well, it's all well and good for you. You've got a staff job and you're not going to have to worry about buying Christmas presents for your rent. And I think there was a moment for them where it was it was just, they were just totally frustrated with me that I'd put another month on their budget. And that continues all the way through. I think it's almost harder now, as I get more senior, negotiating contracts than it is when I first started, because when I first started, I would just take anything to pay my bills, and now a lot of that stuff is not on my CV. But now there's, you become known for certain projects, and you become known for types of development. And I've had lots and lots of offers this year when I've been looking for my next role, and people just want me to wait 2, 3, 4 months to see whether the next project comes up to pay for it. And I'd love to be able to do that, but it's just not an option for me to do that. And I think if I came from a middle-class family that had that sort of pot of money or that sort of trust fund, I would be way more successful than I am, because I could be so much more selective about what I was working on.
Kieren, I mean, how much overlap is there in that case between all of this stuff we talk about in terms of class and an industry which is by its nature a freelance industry? You will always have a certain number of people working commissioning roles, people with jobs. Most of us are going to be freelance at any one point. Is that different? If you don't come from money, if you don't come from means, is freelancing fundamentally a very different proposition?
I think so, but I think this idea of precarity in the work context is sort of chimed from a generation that I'm a part of, wherein, I graduated out of recession. So I think that the economic infrastructure that existed even 10 years ago doesn't exist in the same way. So it was very clear to me very early on that the only way that I would be able to get in and to do free work experiences was when I was in uni. So I was using my student loan to pay for those things. And then when I came out, I got kind of my breaks because there were sort of mentorship programs. There was one in Brixton, and I went, and they gave me an email to somebody at The Guardian, and I emailed them and did a work experience at The Guardian Guide, did 2 weeks, and said, can I please keep pitching you ideas? And I did, and they were good, and then I wrote them, and then I continued writing, and I assumed that there would be jobs available, but there weren't. So I think that, that everything has changed in that way. I think that there's a sort of overwhelming pressure for people to sort of be jack of all trades. So I've certainly, I know what I'm excellent at, and I think that I've been in lots of positions where they're like, oh, you're a really good producer, great, can you just direct this, and actually could you just boom this, and can you actually do this, and actually can you come and help the pitch meeting, and can you help commission? And I think early on in my career I was like, I want to learn all of these things. And I think I feel the same as you. I'm starting to get to a position where I feel like I just want to, become excellent at my one thing. And the idea that you are not prepared to, do a lot of unpaid work doing all of the other things is kind of is leveled against you as being maybe difficult or being entitled. And I think that there is, a shift that has to happen at every point in your career where you're really realizing your own worth and what you can bring. And I think that is it, the quality of what you can bring to an environment is really important. I remember sort of even working on, I was in Mumbai doing a story around kind of tampon tax and all those sorts of things. And when I was sort of pitching it around, some commissioners were like, oh, so you can speak Punjabi? And I was like, yeah. They were like, oh, well, yeah, great. I was like, that's why I pitched the story, But I think that there's, this kind of this sort of you don't always see your additional skills, is what I mean,
Sure.
And I don't think that they're always sort of received in the way that they should be. And I think that this is all sort of changing with the new conversations that are happening. And I think it'll be interesting to see what comes next. But I'm continually incredulous and fascinated at the kind of response that I get back from people saying things like, yeah, you know, could you make that look more urban, or, you know, could you make this look more working class? You know, there was a viral story a couple of weeks ago which was looking at BBC archives when people went to the Haygate estate in Elephant and Castle, and the production crew were asked to, you know, paint graffiti to try and make the environment look, you know, more working class. And I think that stuff, you know, that says it all. Not only the sort of egregiousness of carrying out an act like that, but the very idea that, you know, true working class identity or living in these environments know that you don't need to do that. You know, that you can feel, that you know the sense, your sensory awareness of the space and the while you tell the story does so much more than a painted wall could anyway. And I think that you know, that the nuance is starting to happen. And when it does happen, you can see it, and the quality is really thrilling and beautiful to work on. And that's why we continue, because when it works, it really works, and when it doesn't, it really doesn't.
But the effect of that stuff is so poisonous, because you realise, particularly with social housing, like so many people's ideas who haven't experienced social housing are shaped by exactly those sort of representations where people think, oh, but the people live like animals. Actually, they don't. People live in homes. But actually, the media representation of social housing was these, you know, the Haygate was painted as a hellhole. It was where
or it's a
lived.
fetishization,
Yeah.
or it's like, oh, cool, edgy, and it's like, oh, not really. I got my door kicked in like loads, you know, as like a teenager. And so I think that it's, you know, but it's also, I think that we, if you are from a marginalised community, you're also in this very unique position where you feel like you can tell certain stories very well, but then it becomes very difficult to transcend outside of those. And so I think that what I would say to sort of younger people or people starting off their career is to say, absolutely understand the stories that you are excellent at, but don't be afraid to pitch outside of that, and realise the universality of those stories, and that you can do all of these things. Because if I hadn't had sort of people around me saying that you can do lots of different things, I'd be telling the same story for the last 10 years of my career.
Sure. Paul, we're talking a little bit about the kind of the nuts and bolts, I guess, of working in the industry. I mean, directors, whether it's documentary or feature, there's an assumption, I'm sure you're familiar with this, you know, there's an assumption that if you direct a film and that people see that film, you're off to Beverly Hills at that point. And actually the reality for a lot of directors is, like anyone in the film, I mean, actually it's like you're working on a project and then you're between projects. And then that's where the nuts and bolts kick in. How has that experience been for you?
I mean, I earn far less money as a, you know, director that finances their own projects through a range of crowdfunding and private finance than I did when I was an office manager or a studio manager or an operations manager, you know, 4 years ago. And there is an assumption. There's also an assumption that, you know, if you're a filmmaker, you're not working class. It's considered by some people a middle-class profession, the same way that, you know, there are some people that would say if you're an academic, you can't be working class. But, you know, if we look at, you know, what we earn in terms of, you know, how much we're paid as filmmakers, then certainly, you know, I would qualify under that as being working class. And culturally, I consider myself working class. But I think one of the big problems with you know, funding and financing projects is, and this isn't tied into class, but you just don't get feedback always on why you haven't got it. I mean, you do these applications, and there needs to be more investment on explaining to people, you know, what they've done wrong on the application, because, you know, a lot of it's just made on a whim by a funder or a commissioner, but we need to know why we aren't getting this money. And I think another problem is, you know, when, I don't know what the survey is or the application is like for DocFest when you apply to do Meat Market, but we applied twice for the polystyrene film, you know, and this is a film about a biracial woman who grew up on a council estate and changed the world in a small way, but she was very influential. And we were turned down twice for that because we were told that the project wasn't considered global enough. You know, and Polly is, you know, she's not world famous, but, you know, X-Ray Specs were the only punk band to play a residency at CBGB's. They have an audience, you know, all over the world. And it's a film, as you said to me, you know, she was a walking intersectionality of class, race and gender. You know, it's something that people should be throwing money at. I mean, I'm obviously going to say that, but, you know, that really made me really aware that there are movements, you know, to promote more films by women and about women, which is brilliant. But, you know, there are more movements to encourage people of colour and to tell those stories. But there aren't enough yet about, you know, people from working class backgrounds. And Polly didn't even really enjoy being working class. You know, one of the things that drew me to the story was that she, growing up, you know, on the estate where she lived, experienced a lot of racial abuse. And so she, you know, she had elocution lessons and tried to get away from that identity. But I think we definitely need to sort of, you know, look at the whole funding model. and how that applies to people that are either working class or on lower incomes, because I don't think there's enough work there.
There's a lot of conversation, Billie, about breaking into the industry, and it's an important conversation, but is there also a conversation to then be had, which has maybe been had less, about staying in the industry?
Yeah, 100%. And I also think that, like, just because you've had a couple of jobs or a few TV gigs, it doesn't mean that that's your sole income or that you can survive from that at all. I mean, I remember I had, as every freelancer will be able to relate to, like, a few late invoices. I got paid for something, but I had some debt from a tax bill or something. And I was, like, screwed. I was like, shit, like, I'm not going to be able to pay my rent. I can't survive. And so I got a job temping at this, like, shop in Covent Garden. And I just hosted a BBC Three series. And I remember being in there and someone coming in and being like, aren't you on TV? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, why do you work in this shop? And I was like, to survive? Like, I don't know, I need the money. I was like, do I have to invent a story that I'm doing an immersive series about the retail world, or like something for people to be able to fathom that I have to do another job for it? And I think, like, the thing about this career is that you're doing things that are public facing and that might get press, or, you know, in my case, when I was doing TV work, I might appear in a worst dressed list or something. But so people will assume that you have money or that you come from a certain world. But my reality was that, like, when I first started writing, I was waitressing. And when I first started submitting to magazines, I would write the articles on the back of, like, bits of paper and go into work early and use the computer because I didn't have a laptop. And my career has not been linear at all. Like, my income has gone up and down. And most times, like, you know, I'm selling things on eBay or doing things so that I can invest myself in projects that I really care about. And I think that, like we've said before, that just isn't something that people who come from money have to think about at all. They have a real luxury of being able to kind of pick and choose, or maybe, like, you know, take some time off, figure out what they're doing, move back in with their parents. Like, not everyone has that at all. I certainly don't. So I think that, yes, there needs to be kind of an awareness about people, like, not putting too much pressure on themselves that once you're in the media, that's it. Like, you can go and take a job at a bar or a coffee shop and it doesn't mean that you're a failure. I think that's something that I wish people would be more kind of accepting of.
I mean, Fiona, I want to bring you back into, I mean, how much of this conversation around class, which is about often quite elusive kind of ideas about accent and connections and identity, I mean, how much is it about money? And so certainly when you're in the industry and trying to stay in the industry, how much is it going to be determined by how much you can put away? How much is it going to be determined by making sure that you get paid on time?
I think, you know, at the end of the day, everybody knows how much housing costs in this country, and that for me is a huge issue for everybody. You know, the BBC has offices all across the country, and I do a lot of work, and I'm trying to do partnership work with the nations now, and go to Scotland, go to Belfast, go to Salford, go to Birmingham, and when I'm there, try and sort out, you know, work experience for local kids from colleges there, so it's literally on their doorstep, so they don't have that, well, how am I going to get there kind of thing. And for me, that's really important, because so many of the industry opportunities are still London focused. The money, the people who, you know, the big financing companies who set up the indies, it's all about access to finance. We all know the financial industry's still really male skewed. So I think it's really important to try and somehow localize the opportunities and, you know, the ability for people to get the beginning of their job somewhere else, because you're not necessarily always going to be a presenter your whole life, but you might be a writer, or you might just get into a different facet of the industry, but it can't all be centred around HQs in London. It's just, it's not going to be the answer. And the indies as well. You know, the indies as well, because it's all in London. And that's why, you know, the BBC's out of around the whole of the UK. Channel 4 is going to go that way. But the whole industry just needs to push itself out in terms of where the money decisions sit.
Mm-hmm. Also talk about money. I think that's, you know, and I think that's such a cultural thing, which I was so struck by as a freelancer. You know, when I say to people, oh yeah, you know, this is how much I got for this project, and I'm always open and always tell people, they're like, absolutely shocked by how low it is. And I'm like, oh, of course, maybe you assume that there's money in this industry or, by doing these things. There's not. Just because you might have heard of the project doesn't mean that anyone behind it has got paid. And I think also when you are out of the context, I've done things in the US and worked on films there. It's really funny because they're like, oh, where are you from? I'm like, oh, I'm from the UK. And they're like, oh my God, like it's such a classist boys club there, isn't it? And you're like, yeah, it is, and I think that's really funny because it's difficult for us to see ourselves in the context, and you feel like you're from the outside being like, no, this is a thing, and the sort of overwhelming refusal to see it. People are like, no, things are getting better, it's really great, look at all the women, and you're like, okay, well, more sort of upper middle class women doesn't mean it's going to be better for people like me, and I think that those conversations are so uncomfortable to have because people are still uncomfortable even to talk about how much they would earn on a project, and how will anyone know anything if you don't talk about that.
That goes back to that transparency point for me. The more transparency there is across the board with things like applications and all that, the better.
Well, sorry, you go.
Well, I mean, we were having a conversation yesterday, and you raised a really interesting point about how if you don't come from a middle-class family, there's no one actually to go and talk to about negotiating. So frequently you spend your entire sort of first 10 years of your career just trying to guess what you should be paid and like accepting rates that are like drastically lower than what other people are accepting. And we need some sort of informal network for people that come from, working class backgrounds where they can go and talk to people and get advice. It was only after I got mentors in the industry that I would realise that I was being paid way too low, or that I shouldn't have taken a contract without holiday, or, those kind of terms you don't get taught, and you can't go back to your parents. My dad was a lorry driver. He had no idea how to tell me whether to negotiate a contract a certain way or not. And that's a big barrier, I think, for people learning, to have those money conversations.
I want to sort of bring people into this conversation, but just before we do that, the session is called Breaking the Class Ceiling. It feels like there's class ceilings going on. There's a ceiling to actually get in, there's a ceiling to stay in. And I wonder, Fiona, I kind of want to put this point to you, is there also a ceiling about making what feels in some ways like that final jump into the commissioning, the executive role, where it doesn't feel, my background's film, and certainly in film, there's a lot of nodding and smiling, and everyone is very keen on the idea of socio-economic diversity. But once you see who is actually doling the money out, you don't see a huge amount of that actually in principle. TV feels like it genuinely does feel like it's a little further down the line. But is that going to be the ultimate ceiling that has to be broken? Is actually making sure that, if we talk about education, for instance, 93% of people in this country went to state school, 7% went to private school. When you look at the strata of commissioners and executives, you're going to be one of the few people that we could bring into a conversation like this not coming from a private school background.
I think, it's undoubtedly very important. Just by its very definition, there's fewer of those jobs because, it's, so it means it's more intense, the competition. And I think it is changing just because I stepped away into digital for a few years. I've come back and I noticed there's different people around. Things have changed in the past 3 years a bit, nowhere near enough. And I do think it is crucially important because you do want the nature of conversations in rooms to change and the accessibility to those conversations to change exactly so people get feedback on exactly why something wasn't going to happen, or because the lack of I go back to this word transparency, but the opaqueness of trying to figure out how how decisions are made, why things happen when they happen, it doesn't help anybody. So I applaud all the schemes, that the broadcasters have. Because I was coming to this, I was talking to some of the indies I met in the past couple of weeks, saying to them, well, do you think TV's very middle class? What do you think? These are not like big cheese indie owners, these are just creative director types. And what was interesting that came back to me that made me feel a bit more positive was that people like Kat Lewis at 9 Lives, who's built a very successful business, she said to me she's put 1,000 people through work experience in that company in over a decade. That's pretty amazing. Seven Wonder in Birmingham, they've got a real push on to retain their entry-level talent through Birmingham. And then there's Firecrest here in Govan, and Govan is obviously a really important place to generate local employment. So I think that eventually will gain a momentum that will push through. So I'm hopeful, but is 5 years fast enough? Do you know what I mean? Nothing's moving fast enough. It all needs to move much, much faster.
On that note, I kind of want to hand it over. You've been very patient listening to us. A hand went up here very quickly. I'll try and make sure as many people as possible can speak.
Oh, hi. I'm from Argentina, and I come from like a poor background. And I want just to ask you, because when I started working like in film, I'm just beginning. One thing that struck me is that like the industry, like you were saying, freelancing and all that, the industry it's not like your normal 9-to-5 job. Obviously, sometimes you have to even go and create your own jobs and have to go and pitch and all this. And from my background, that's not something like we used to do. Like my family, they're poor, and they're like, oh no, you have to have a normal job. This is how you do. And this thing of selling yourself is really odd. I wonder if you can comment from your own experience. And even like applying for a job, you have to like write like a really good letter, like on this and all that. It's just not very used.
It's interesting. Anyone who wants to pick that up.
I think for things like that, because whenever I first entered the business, and people would say to me, "Oh, you got a network," and I'm like, "What the hell is networking?" Do you know what I mean? It's like, and that's why this mentoring thing. Initially, I was like, "What the hell is mentoring?" Comes in, and that's just where you have somebody who you can. And they give you a bit of confidence and a bit of direction and a bit of just go on, do itness. That's what you need, so that whenever you've got to, they'll help wire you in also to the people who are a bit more receptive out there, as opposed to the brick walls that are still out there as well. So it is a strange. I agree. It's not as bad as it is in America, believe you me, but. It's something that you just need somebody to help you through those first few steps on it, and then it'll not feel so weird. I know exactly what you mean.
That doesn't have to be someone formal. Like whenever I go back to my secondary school or those kind of places, people are like, well, where do I apply for a mentor? And actually the first thing I get them to do when I start, I sort of do like a couple of months of mentoring people initially to help them find the right person for them. And quite frequently, the first thing I'll do is I'll get them to write down their 5 favourite films, and we'll look at who directed them or produced them or exec them, and they will just write a really personal email to that person saying, you've got my dream career, I love the things that you've made, would you give me a bit of guidance because I'm new to the industry and I need a bit of support, would you just meet for a cup of coffee? And that's how I met Fiona, was doing that. And there's a lot of really good people in the industry, like we can bitch and moan about nepotism, but actually there's a lot of really lovely people that do want to help people get by. So just one personal email, people get flooded. I mean, I get hundreds of emails about this sort of stuff, but you can tell when someone's actually really done their research about you and really genuinely is interested in what you do, and that will break through.
So there's a hand sort of just up here. I'll try and make sure I get back down over here, which got lost in translation.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to say is that this is essentially a political problem, and it won't change until we have political representatives who see the need for change. And what I would say is that we have laws, several laws, which define certain kinds of broadcasting as a public service. Now, why is it that for most of the last century, there was general agreement in our society that the public services, education, policing, healthcare, they should provide regular, secure forms of employment? That was generally socially accepted. And it was only in the late 20th century, from the 1980s onwards, that we began to see in broadcasting a complete reversal of the principle of secure employment. That's why I call it essentially a political question. And we can talk about access until we're blue in the face, but until there's security of employment, we're not going to solve the problem.
So that's the freelance question, essentially writ large, I guess. That we're until people have jobs, we're going to keep circling back to these same problems. There seems to be widespread agreement about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the panel mainly are sort of affected by that issue rather than being part of that problem. And you're right, there needs to be massive structural change. But as Fiona said earlier, it's not going to happen quickly. And so from my point of view, while it's all well and good us lobbying for places like BAFTA or the BBC to be doing stuff about this, in the meantime, it's sort of individual responsibility to be helping people up. Like Fiona helped me up at a time that I was quite prepared to leave the industry, which is very much connected to my background and my class. And now I mentor 5 people, and they're all, doing very well. And I tell them that if I'm going to help them, they have to help others. And so until those big structural changes happen, until politics addresses it, I think individually we should all be going away saying, okay, well, maybe I should go back to my secondary school and help a kid, or maybe I should be offering up the research that seems to be struggling an hour of my time for a cup of coffee, because that one person you might help could have a big ripple effect across the industry.
It's a huge frustration, though, because obviously a lot of these conversations, and this conversation being one of them, the central reason we're having to do this is because class is not a protected characteristic legally. And so in 2010, when the Equalities Act was introduced, class, the great lost opportunity, really, class was in the draft legislation and was then dropped from the draft legislation once the 2010 election happened and the next government took over. So because of that, class doesn't enjoy the same legally protected status that other areas do, and it means that we are continually going to keep circling around this, I think, unless, as Victoria says, unless a lot of us step up and a lot of organisations step up as well. We've got time for another we've got another question here, and I think we're probably then going to have to take the conversation outside.
She has the microphone.
Oh.
Got 5 minutes.
Hi.
We've got 5 minutes, it's all fine. Let's do these 2 questions. If we can rattle through them.
We'll do it quickly. I want to thank everyone on the panel for, it's the first time I've heard some of these things actually said openly in a room. There's something really unnerving and shocking about that, but also reassuring.
No one's going to work again after this.
But on that, there's a really, really interesting thing about the Sheffield Doc Fest. It's full of people who make films about people like us, and sometimes we're the people who kind of nothing about us without us. We want to be telling our own stories, our communities. And very often when I'm a delegate here, and I often see other people and they'll kind of walk past you. If you don't look interesting or wealthy enough, they'll drop you like a hot snot and move on to somebody more interesting. And I just want to know, what advice do you guys have for someone like me who's got nothing, but a lot of hope, a lot of optimism, maybe not youth. How do you guys deal with the Sheffield Doc Fest? Because I'm serious, because all the volunteers are always incredibly nice and trying to secure opportunities, and we're also paying here to be here to try and kind of secure some opportunities. What really, and there's a difference from a commissioner's viewpoint and a freelancer's, but I'm interested in hearing both. And tell the truth, please.
I think drinking helps, because then you lose all inhibitions and you'll go and talk to anyone. So that's how I've managed Sheffield Doc Fest for the last 5 years.
I would say, I think you should watch and take, now is not necessarily the moment we have to engage with everybody. It's about absorbing the things that you feel passionate about. And as Victoria said, it's a really good tip, following up afterwards and say, I saw your piece, I saw your work at this is what really appealed to me, this is how I align with that. And because often the exchanges that these are just too frenetic, that they're not necessarily that meaningful. So I wouldn't get too head up in that in a weird way. I would just watch it and try and really enjoy the content and things that strike you. And then follow up.
Drunk.
Follow up.
I'm going to squeeze in the world's quickest question over here.
You're all on the panel. Just briefly, so I work in education with secondary schools in London, and people are very units, exclusions, inclusion, so the kind of whole spectrum. And I think that very much this needs to be a topic that's introduced. Obviously, there's great schemes for 16 and beyond, but this needs to be introduced age 11 onwards, the conversation needs to start early enough. We have amazingly bright, capable voices, and I think in a way there needs to be more breathing space within schools and the attitude towards the arts, It's not, obviously we need scientists, we need doctors, we need, but there's a fear, My parents will want me to do science, that there's a lack of that the attitude, yes, I'm going to commit myself to the arts, and not enough, conversation. And also, essentially, what is documentary? What is documentary making? What is essentially it's storytelling. It's going into your backgrounds. Let's do poetry. Let's do it. Start young, age 11. It doesn't have to be. Let's start with media industry. It's let's start with storytelling, with expression. With writing, and that, it needs to be more breathing space. And
everybody sign up for Speakers for Schools. It's dead easy, it's brilliant, and they organise it for you. Everybody should do that.
And we all think schools have a really pivotal part.
It's a no-brainer, isn't it? Because the way that young people engage with the world, the majority of them is on their phones, and they watch video, they YouTube, and all these other things. So it should be, I think, mandatory that in school they teach, the art of making video and film. It's a no-brainer for them.
Yeah, and it's so empowering. I did this program in Bangladesh, and all the kids there were like, well, we'll never work in TV or film. And I was like, do you not realise how unique the place that you live is? Do you not like where do you live? What do your parents do? And they went away and they wrote these treatments, and they were so excited and realised, with talking to me with such kind of passion and pride about where they come from, because I was like, oh, that's really different from where I come from. I think that documentary can be such an empowering thing. I would have loved it if it was something that we spoke about at school. I agree. Can't you do it? Can't you introduce it?
I was just going to say, I work at a PRU I live in Lambeth, and it's made up, that's a pupil referral unit, and it's made up of people that live in Lambeth, Southwark and Tower Hamlets. And it's sort of that age group of 13 to 18-year-olds. And my overwhelming sense from that is two things. One is exactly what you're saying, is kind of saying your story is worth telling, absolutely, this is really interesting. But also, from a more philosophical perspective, just saying there is space for that. And I think that sometimes the feedback that I get a lot of the time is, but we're all just telling the same story. And I think that it's about saying, no, you're really not. You can tell the same story in 100 different ways, and there is space for you. And I think that if there's anything that can be taken away, it's that. I always want people to know that just because something has been done, or somebody who hasn't applied a nuanced lens might think it's exactly the same as something else, or a commissioner who doesn't get it might not get it. That's not the end of that. And it's about saying, no, there's space for me, and there's space for this story that you think that you've heard before but you haven't. And that is a conversation that I have all the time, and I encourage you to sort of keep telling them that, and then we can pick up.
We're going to have to leave it there. But listen, thank you to this most excellent panel. And if you do us one favour, I suppose collectively, it's to keep this conversation going. But thank you for coming today.